Welcome to the broadcast. My name is Douglas Gabriel, and today I'd like to talk about an article that we have, which you'll find in the information box below, and it's all about Isis. And really, it's about the transition from the ancient matriarchal culture to the current patriarchal culture, which is now, of course, you'd call it the end of the empire or the end of the Kali Yuga, which ended in 1900, but there's been a hangover of a lot of patriarchal influence, war, legalism, all the kinds of things that we are facing today. So in this dark period, some even call it an apocalyptic period. Some even think that it's the end of times. But Tyler and I have discussed this and thought, well, what can we do to give something to people that can give them a new icon, a new leitmotif, a new archetype that they can follow, and not go back to the ancient matriarchal system, because that's not advancement of culture. What we need is the next step. And the next step is what we're going to talk about. When you think of Isis, generally people will see Isis with Horus seated on her lap, basically the foundation for the Madonna and Child. And this is really what that myth is about. It is about the transference to the new child that's being born in all of us, the Christ and higher self. And in the age of the consciousness soul, that would mean that we are reaching up into the realm of spirit self, or the monastic principle, the principle of thoughts which have eternal substance in them. Now, when we want to be inspired by anything, you can go to Rudolf Steiner, but in this particular case, this is more than an inspiration. It's more than an indication. It is a new mythology. It is what Novalis tells us is a new way to write history, so that you make history a fairy tale or a myth. And we are in that myth. And when we look back at the other myths, you see that, for instance, with the Greek myths, that the ancient gods who were created to begin with were overthrown, and that there's always stages. And then the second stage of the gods, Zeus and the Olympians, were overthrown by the heroes. So it was the Titans and Cronus, and then it was Zeus, and then it was human beings. And it is the time for human beings to take up not just the patriarchal or the matriarchal, but to take up that new impulse of Horus, because Isis's child is Horus. And we're going to talk about today because Rudolf Steiner wrote a new Isis myth. And that is the content of what we're going to discuss. But first, let's put it into a framework. When you talk about the Isis-Osiris myth, it is the oldest myth in the pantheon, which is called the Aeneid, or the 9 gods of Egypt. And so in this story are some of those gods: Geb, the god of the earth; Nut, the goddess of the sky; Osiris, Isis, Horus; their enemy, Set, who's called by Rudolf Steiner Typhon, and in the new Isis myth, he calls him Typhon-Ahriman. And Nephthys and a few others are involved in this story. So let's look at the story historically before we look at what Rudolf Steiner has done as a new inspiration. But he called it an open secret. And he said that when you would go to see the first Gertianum, there was a statue in the back of the stage, which was actually the central pillar of the entire building. And he called it the representative of man, or humanity. So the representative of humanity is the very sculpture. I believe it's 27 feet tall. I've spent many hours sitting at its feet trying to contemplate what Rudolf Steiner said in this new Isis myth, because he said behind that statue is the new Isis, and that we must lift the veil of Isis. As in the past they said no one can lift the veil of Isis without dying, he said we must lift the veil of Isis so that we can bring life. Well, in the ancient Egyptian mythology, which is really very, very complicated, this myth is broken up into many, many, many other components, which have everything to do with Egypt, with the rulership of the upper and the lower kingdom, with the eye of Horus, with the battle between Set and Horus, with the death of Osiris, which is described in many different ways. So what we're going to take here is the general story that is told by Plutarch. And Plutarch says that it goes like this. Osiris supposedly had sex with the wife of Set, Nephthys. This made Set, or Typhon as Steiner calls him, so we'll refer to him as Set when we're talking in the Egyptian. So Set got very angry with Osiris, so he decided to kill him. But Osiris was the god at that time really of the sun. Later, Isis becomes the goddess of the sun, and her child, Horus, becomes literally the solar deity that has been predicted in at least 27 different solar deity myths in other cultures, including Egypt. So when Set became very angry with Osiris, he decided to trick him. And he was so powerful that he had to have a good trick. So he built a coffin, a beautiful coffin, which is basically later on extrapolated into being mummification and the ritual burying of beings that would then go into the underworld. Well, Set built a beautiful coffin, and he said, whoever this coffin fits perfectly can have it. And so the gods, one at a time, laid in the coffin until in the end, Osiris laid in it and it fit him perfectly. And at that time, Set and 72 others jumped on the coffin, put the lid on it, nailed it down, and threw the coffin into the Nile. Well, of course, Isis was distraught, and she and actually Nephthys and others went to look for Osiris. And eventually, there's different variant stories, but Plutarch says that the coffin floated to Byblos and was basically incorporated into the growth of a tree. And eventually Isis and her helpers found this coffin in the tree because it had been made into a pillar in Byblos. So she was able to get the coffin out of the pillar and bring it back to Egypt and open it. But at that point, Seth again jumped on Osiris and cut him into pieces. In Plutarch's story, it's 14 pieces. In other stories, it's 42 pieces for each of the different areas of Egypt, and then threw those pieces into the Nile and scattered them throughout all of Egypt. Again, Isis went to find Osiris, gathered up his pieces, let's call it 14 pieces, but one piece was missing, and that was his genitalia. So he no longer had the capacity to generate, but he was in fact dead. But Isis, sometimes who appears in the form of a falcon or a hawk or what's called a kite, another bird, an amazing bird that is very powerful, that flies all over Egypt to find its prey, incredibly powerful bird. She took Osiris, took the 13 pieces, and breathed life into him just long enough that he could, in fact, impregnate her with the child Horus. But she was not able to bring him back to life. And so, unfortunately, he was mummified, put in the earth, and he was no longer the god of the sun. He was the god of the earth. Geb, the earth, was his father, of course, Nut his mother. So he was no longer in the realm of Nut, which is female. He was in the realm of the male god Geb. Then, because Isis was pregnant, she eventually had the child Horus. Now, Horus is this image that I mentioned to begin with, the Madonna and child, or Horus sitting on her lap of Isis. And Set, of course, found this to be very offensive. And when Horus got a little bit older, he grew very fast. Set went into a war with Horus. The war, in some versions, went many different directions, but we'll just cut to the chase. Eventually, Set turns into a hippopotamus in the Nile River, and with the help of Isis, Horus is able to subdue, and in some stories, kills Set, Typhon, and then becomes the ruler of both the upper and lower kingdom. In other variant versions, Set ruled one part of the kingdom, the south, and Horus ruled the north, and in the battle, Horus's eye is plucked from his head. And this eye then becomes the famous Eye of Horus. Well, once Horus is the king of the united Egypt, in Plutarch's version, Isis is somewhat put into the background, but she then goes from being a moon goddess to the sun goddess. And Horus, of course, represents the sun goddess. And later, particularly through Akhenaten and other pharaohs, they worshipped Set as the sun god Ra or Atum. So in essence, this is a solar deity story. And when you're talking about the coffin being thrown in the Nile and Osiris, the Egyptians lived off of the Nile in the raising of the Nile in its seasonal flooding. And they looked to the star Sirius as the demarcation of when that flood would come. And of course, everything on both sides of the Nile became extraordinarily fertile. Well, this is again a story of Osiris, that Osiris was made fertile by Isis, the sun goddess now. And Horus became the ruler of all of Egypt. Well, if you went to the temple of Sias, which is a temple dedicated to Isis, when you got into the inner sanctuary, you saw a statue, and the statue had an inscription below it, and it said, "I am Isis. I am the past, the present, and the future. No one has lifted my veil and lived." In the new Isis story, the new Isis myth of Rudolf Steiner says that inscription is changed now, and it is, "I am Isis. I am the past, the present, and the future. All people, all men," he says, "all people must raise my veil to live." So Isis was the hidden secrets of nature, whether it be the sun, the moon, or the earth, whether it be the rising of the Nile, or giving birth to what we would call the higher self, Horus. But now, Isis, in the new mythology, is a completely different person. So let me explain that. In the article that we have created for you, which you can find below, we point out that Rudolf Steiner, in approximately 4 or 5 different descriptions, indicates the true meaning of the new Isis myth. Well, that new Isis myth is something that most people can understand, and I do not pretend to be able to understand all the components of it, and I can't offer you a full commentary on it or a true interpretation that would cover all that Rudolf Steiner puts in this very short myth. But in the article that we wrote, he describes that this Set dash Typhon is also Typhon Ahriman. And that's very key to understand this myth. And he says that Isis can now be found in what he called the sculpture of the representative of man, or the representative of humanity. And this sculpture is a very, very large sculpture. He had help with it from a very famous sculptress, Edith Marion. And in the middle of it is a statue of Christ. And Rudolf Steiner said that sculpting in wood, as he sculpted this amazing statue and the surrounding area, he said that to put the right expression on the face of Christ was one of the most difficult and profound things that anyone could do, and particularly for his own life. So he worked on this with incredible love and devotion. And when you look at this, you see a being who has a hand raised up into the realm of Lucifer. And there you see in the background sculpture, Lucifer falling from heaven to the earth, and the raised hand of Christ reaching into that realm of Lucifer. Below the sculpture, in somewhat of a cave, an alcove, is the being of Ahriman. This is the being of darkness, of death, the calcified, sclerotic forces that we now would call materialism. And these forces are trying to pull the Christ down into this underworld, whereas the forces of Lucifer are trying to pull him up. Now, let me clarify Lucifer. Lucifer, one could say, was that cosmic wisdom that was inappropriate, and it is still inappropriate, because what Lucifer wishes to do is exactly what the sculpture indicates: pull you out of your body. And you must have a balance between Lucifer and Ahriman, or you will be torn apart. If you go with Lucifer, you will be like Lucifer. You will fall into the thoughts that you think are yours, and you won't understand what cosmic thinking really is. So Lucifer, as the Christian stories tell in the Bible and in the book of Apocalypse of St. John, Lucifer fell from heaven by the stroke of the sword given to the archangel Michael, and he fell down to the earth. But Lucifer is still with us. And in fact, Rudolf Steiner points out that Lucifer, well, this is quite debatable, whether he says in the 3rd millennium BC. So you can debate this all day long, and the anthroposophists really practically come to fisticuffs over this issue of when Lucifer incarnated. Because if Christ was the turning point of time, as Rudolf Steiner points out in the mystery of Golgotha, then there should be a balance between the incarnation of Lucifer and what we have now as the incarnation of Ahriman. And so Rudolf Steiner said, not one day of the 2nd millennium, AD, our millennium, would go by that Ahriman would not be incarnated. He even described where, in the Northwest, and that it would be by necessity that he would incarnate so that he could merge the East and the West. Again, one of the mysterious indications of Rudolf Steiner, which is debated so hotly that literally people lose friendships over this, because they want to believe absolutely that these are the very times Rudolf Steiner described, and this is the time that Ahriman will incarnate. Many believe, because Ahriman is the ruler of machines and materialism, that Ahriman will enter into the internet. They even debate that transhumanism is a good thing, and that Ahriman will incarnate into the internet and become what is considered a super artificial intelligence. As a matter of fact, there are literally churches that have been created, prepared and waiting and praying for the moment that the super artificial intelligence, AI, will incarnate to tell human beings exactly what to do. In other words, to give away their ego to what a machine tells them to do, to leave human intelligence behind for artificial intelligence, believing that materialistic machine intelligence is better than human intelligence. And on the other hand, you have what some people would debate are very Luciferic tendencies in our age. Some people, in derogatory tones, call it New Age, or they call it Gaiaism, or they give it every type of name. One could even say the resurgence of Wicca and witchcraft and magic. All these things would be considered by anthroposophists to be very Luciferic. So we are torn between Lucifer trying to pull us out of the world so that we don't integrate with the world, that we don't have an ego, and Ahriman pulling us down to literally eat the ego of the human being and stop human development for the future. And in between, the Christ, who is, as Steiner points out, the representative of humanity. That sculpture shows us who we are. Now, that can be related to fairly easily if you have studied anthroposophy and you know that there's not only just two forces pulling you apart, telling you one to go in one direction, Lucifer and Ahriman telling you to go in the other direction, but in the middle, attacking our own Christ center, the heart, are also beings who work for Ahriman but are preparing for the incarnation of the sun demon Sorat or Sorath. Well, Christ, Horus, is a representation of the sun being, and we each have a sun in our hearts. So these forces are attacking our own sacred I am, our own individuality, the reincarnating human individuality. And unfortunately, these forces are so powerful at this time that they can, in fact, subsume and supplant the development of the human ego or the human I am. So nothing could be more apropos than this particular statue. But Rudolf Steiner, in his new Isis myth, after he explains some of the content before he gives this myth in other lectures, and we provided those for you, as well as the full version of the new Isis myth, which is taken from the lecture series Ancient History. And he says something to the effect of the following. He says that the new Isis myth, well, first off, he gives the prior injunctions that this is the most important open secret of our time. It is, in fact, the most important mystery of our time. And we can solve this mystery ourselves. And we don't have to have anyone else help us. We don't need a guru. We don't need an anthroposophical lineage. We don't need to meet the people who knew Rudolf Steiner. We don't need to make a cult of the personality with Rudolf Steiner. We simply need to take his words, do what he says, and see what happens. So I had read these things before I'd gone to Dornach the first time. I've been there numerous times since. And there's a room where this sculpture was saved, because the sculpture, when the first Goetheanum burnt, was in the wood shop, and Rudolf Steiner was still working on it. And it is, in fact, an unfinished sculpture, because Rudolf Steiner died before it could be finished. So it was one of the few things that was saved from the first Goetheanum. First Goetheanum was the most beautiful and one of the largest wooden buildings ever built. And it was built upon columns, and the columns represent the ages of humankind. And the large dome, the large cupola, has inscribed on it the ancient development that prepared the earth for human beings coming to it. In other words, what Rudolf Steiner calls the three previous incarnations of the earth, called Saturn, ancient sun, ancient moon, which do not relate to those planets, by the way. We are now in the incarnation of the earth. And so in that large cupola is the three previous ages. And then in the smaller cupola, which met together, one was much larger than the other one, in the small cupola, beneath it, on pillars, and at the base of each pillar was a throne for the being who ruled that particular time. And in fact, when you look straight through the building, in from the large into the small cupola, the domes, and you see this statue, if it had been standing there in its place, one would see that to the right and the left, you have the same story painted in magnificent, absolutely magnificent and very unique style, but in magnificent pictures, the evolution of mankind from the past into the future. And so it's somewhat of a mirror image on both, on the two sides. So if you looked up, you could actually see into the past and into the future. And we stood in the present as the representative of humanity, the representative of man, this amazing sculpture of Rudolf Steiner, trying to tell us in an open secret, as he calls it again and again, who we are, where we have been, and where we are going. Then he says in the myth, he says, in the land of the Philistines, materialism, people would come and see this beautiful building. And there were the secrets, the open secrets of the mysteries. But many would not see that. They did not have the eyes to see it. And if they would look at the sculpture, they would just see it as some of these things I've described, and maybe have even great sensitivity to it, but they could not see the hidden mystery, which was an open secret. He says the open secret is in fact invisible, and it is behind, and in some cases he says underneath, but in that sculpture, hidden in the sculpture, behind it, below it, and above it, is the new Isis. Now, from that point on, it gets rather complicated to understand what it is that he's talking about. But essentially, he says that this new Isis has a child, and she's not very aware of the child or what the child's meaning is, which I interpret to mean, in my own personal opinion, that it's an unfolding mystery. He says that this child is born after this being comes before the statue, the representative of mankind, humanity, and this being is Set, but he calls him Typhon Ahriman. So the being of Ahriman himself, which definitely goes along with the idea that Ahriman is incarnated, or at least that the statue will be there long enough so that when Ahriman does come before it as a human being, incarnated in a human being, as Lucifer incarnated in the ancient times in China and brought cosmic wisdom much too early, Ahriman now wishes to basically supplant all cosmic wisdom. And Sophia, of course, means wisdom. And so when you say Isis, you might as well say Isis Sophia. And sometimes he says Mary Sophia. So as Typhon Ahriman looks at this statue, and this baby is born, Ahriman, Typhon, assumes that the baby is his. So Isis, instead of going to look for Osiris, the lost Osiris, takes the child and carries her around all over the earth. And unfortunately, the child, more or less, falls into 14 pieces. Eventually, these pieces are gathered up. And in other lectures, he says that Ahriman gathers them up in one way that makes it a wooden puppet. In other words, a dead resemblance to what the real child is supposed to be. In other words, if Ahriman gathers up these pieces of the wisdom of Sophia, which of course also refer to the waxing and waning of the moon, half of a moon cycle, which also refers to what Rudolf Steiner calls the Mars and Mercury stages of the Earth, or what we can also call ancient matriarchal culture. And then in 2000 BC, about the time that Lucifer came, it turned into a patriarchal culture and entered into what the ancient Hindus, ancient Indian culture, calls the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, approximately from 3101 BC to 1899 or 1900. And then in 1900, literally, he says, a new age is born, the age that the Indians would call Satya Yuga, or what Rudolf Steiner would call the age of, well, it's really the birth of the human I am in a conscious fashion that is in this particular period since 1415 has developed in the third aspect of the soul called the consciousness soul. The two previous aspects, the sentient soul and the intellectual soul. The intellectual soul was the Greek period, where he said that the Greek literally stood before a being that they believed and called Sophia. And that is why the Greeks focused so much on philosophia, the love of Sophia, the love of wisdom. But this was a human-like form that stood before them. Well, that was outside of them in the Greek times. But in our times, in the consciousness soul era, as we gather up these pieces, you could call them the pieces of wisdom. Some call it the pieces of anthroposophy. If we gather them up instead of Ahriman gathering them up, they aren't a wooden puppet anymore. They are in fact the living nature of the waxing human heart, which is becoming from its soul, becoming a spirit, or in other words, from the consciousness soul into what Steiner calls the spiritual soul that can tap into the higher principles of thought found in the realm of the spirit self, or according to ancient Hindu philosophy, called manas, or manasic thinking, warmed up thinking, thoughts that don't just arise from the head, but thoughts that come from the heart that also fire the will, the three parts of the body, thinking in the head, feeling in the heart, and willing in the limbs. So if we can gather up those pieces, those are the pieces of our past. They're the pieces of wisdom that we would call Sophia. And Rudolf Steiner says that there's a progression of this. So if you could understand the past with the old Isis myth, then you would understand that that was called Isis, Sophia. In the Greek times, it was called Philosophia. But in the modern times, Rudolf Steiner spoke about this, and essentially one could say it is a very core element of anthroposophy. He calls this being, who is a very living being, and in fact was there with Rudolf Steiner when he was putting the foundation stone in the ground for the first Gratianum, and also there after that building burnt, and he had the Christmas conference where he gave the teachings for the new time, which he calls the being of Anthroposophia. So we are to develop this being of Anthroposophia. That is our mission. It is to take the wisdom and not leave it in the realm of Lucifer, and not let it be consumed, overwhelmed, and killed by the being of Ahriman. But both Lucifer and Ahriman would like to kill that wisdom, because that is the wisdom that gives human beings the freedom in the soul to rise up to the spirit. In other words, it's the future nature of the human being. And during the Christmas conference, he gave the foundation stone meditation, which he said was a path of initiation to meet the being of Anthroposophia. He describes this being of Anthroposophia as the being of wisdom who passes into, not like the Greeks, where she stands outside and they relate to her outside, or even with the scholastic philosophers that they find her in nature, or in our new theories today that we call it the Gaia theory. No, Anthroposophia is a being who is living and growing along with the development of all human beings on the earth. She's in advance of us in her development and therefore can give us exactly what we need. But he says that each time we take a step with wisdom into the spirit realm, Sophia passes literally through our bodies and is there, more or less, as the midwife of the birth of these spiritual steps that we're taking. Some of the most intimate language that he uses in all of Anthroposophy is speaking about Anthroposophia. And so many anthroposophists and people who study Rudolf Steiner do not understand this. They do not understand what in the world is Rudolf Steiner talking about. But if you go back to the lectures that I referred to, which are in the article, and read them carefully, you will see that the following can be found there. In the past, the large dome of the Goetheanum, we have the ancient Saturn, Sun, and Moon. Rudolf Steiner, in his lectures on Faust, described that being as the mothers, the three mothers. And he gives incredibly clear descriptions there. And so it's hard to understand why anthroposophists won't acknowledge that the mothers, who he then collectively calls the mother, is the foundation upon which we stand in the natural world. All physical manifestation comes from the donations of the hierarchical beings who gave gifts to humanity to prepare the ground upon which we walk, the plants on which we eat, the animals that teach us everything about the astral world, and then leave us alone in the earth incarnation to develop an independent, free I am. In other words, if we saw Sophia right now standing outside of us, we would have no freedom. We would, of course, more or less, worship the being of wisdom, or at least completely dedicate your life to it like the Greeks did. But we must be free so that we can develop the capacity of love. That is the secret of course, Christ's teachings. It's as simple as that. Love one another and love yourself and love God. That's it. The Old Testament laws are all boiled down into the golden rule, essentially. And so if Ahriman can steal our capacity to love by making our hearts cold and dead, and if Lucifer can turn our thoughts from being warmed up, beautiful thoughts that are filled with compassion, then we basically fall into materialism and believe that there is no such being. And if we could see these beings very clearly, again, we would have no freedom. If you could see God, you would have no freedom. Plus, you would probably know instantaneously that if you saw God, then there are forces that oppose God. And so you'd probably see the devil. People who have apparitions, people who have near-death experiences, to tell whether it was true, all you have to do is listen to the first thing they say. If they did not experience the fires of hell before they saw the divine light of heaven, then their vision or their experience might need to be questioned, because that's what all the apparitions and the people say who have those apparitions, is that first they're shown this evil of Ahriman in this realm of hell below us, and then they may be shown the divine light. But when they are, they're always told the same thing. You have to do something with it. So if you think you've risen into heaven and seen your guardian angel, who you would probably think was God himself or herself, or if you rose up to the realm of the archangels or the time spirits, you would be completely overwhelmed. And you probably wouldn't remember a thing when you came back, unless when you were in that realm, you were told what almost everyone is told who comes back from that realm or has a vision of that realm. You must do something with it. You must manifest in the physical world to help others. Rudolf Steiner says that if you experience the spiritual world and you go across the threshold between the physical and the spiritual, you know it's true if you come back filled with fiery compassion for will, for deeds of will, goodwill. And when that happens, you will know it. And it's an inspiration, an intuition that will last you the rest of your life. So that is why we can't see Sophia, wisdom, right now. That's why we don't see Lucifer and Ahriman or the other beings I described. They are called the Asuras, because we would not be left in freedom. So as you look at this statue, and it's still there today in Dornach in the second Gertianum, which is also a magnificent building made out of pressed concrete, poured concrete, which Rudolf Steiner was actually one of the first people to develop that form of building. And it is a magnificent building. And you go into a room that the sculpture is, it's not on the stage. And you sit there, you look at it long enough, you're not going to see a sculpture, as he says. You will see the invisible being of what you could call Isis Sophia and the birth of her child, Horus. In other words, the being of God the Father, the goddess or the component of the mother, and their child, Christ. And that's you. So as you look at Lucifer, you're looking at the past. And if we have a full picture of the past, as Rudolf Steiner gives us in his lectures on Faust, you will call them the mothers or the mother. God the Father doesn't manifest in this realm as Christ told us. But the goddess Sophia, the mother or the mothers, is a co-equal member of either that original Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, or perhaps a coincident Trinity, a female divine female Trinity, which work together, and they have other components. And so Rudolf Steiner describes these other components. He describes a being who is also female that descends, obviously, from the Trinity into the realm of the Kyrieutetes, a hierarchical rank that is called wisdom, which is also the name of Sophia. So from the realm of the Kyrieutetes, Sophia then descended all the way down to overlight the being of Mary, from the beings of wisdom, motion, form, time, archangels, angels, and then did not incarnate completely in the being of Mary. But when the Kyrieutetes, what is sometimes called the daughter of Sophia, and Sophia, the mother, is the cosmic Sophia, but this Sophia comes all the way down with the Christ, who descended from the Trinity into the realm of the Elohim, the realms of form, to give human beings their I am, their free I am, their free ego. These two beings came down, but Christ came all the way into a human form and balanced out as a human the incarnation of a human in the 3rd millennium BC of Lucifer, and in our time, in the 2nd millennium, as Ahriman. So this balance, as Steiner calls it, the turning point of time when Christ incarnated, is balanced by these two forces. So the Kyrieutetes, one could say, is the daughter of Sophia, just as we would call Christ the son of the Father. But also clearly in the lectures that we present before we give you the new Isis myth so that you can possibly understand it, there is the being described that Rudolf Steiner calls the Holy Sophia or Anthroposophia, as I have given you a description. This Anthroposophia is in the human realm and is actually developing along with us. So you can find quite clearly three different Sophias described. And Sergei Prokofiev, in his book on the Sophia, describes two of them, but he does not describe the third, which is very strange. So many anthroposophists couldn't take the next step to find the third aspect, the mothers or the mother. They could find the being of wisdom, Sophia, Anthroposophia, but they can't find the mother. Well, it's clearly in the lectures. If one reads it and meditates and contemplates on it, you will find that there are distinctly three Sophias that are described. Well, it would only make sense in a realm that is always dual, the realm of the physical. There's always a duality. So if that's the case, it's quite simple to say that perhaps in Rudolf Steiner's time, it wasn't appropriate or wasn't the right time to reveal the nature of the divine feminine trinity. But it is clearly there. And in the New Isis myth, one can also find it implicit in what he calls the open secret or the invisible Isis Sophia that is behind the representative of humanity, this sculpture. And also then, if you looked above you in the original Goetheanum, if the sculpture was in its right place, one would see that Christ is standing there, and then the forces of Lucifer and Ahriman are displayed in the historical pictures, the images that are on the inside of the dome of the first Goetheanum. Now, Tyla, Dr. Tyla Gabriel, my lovely and incredible wife, wrote a book. It's 3 books, actually. It's a trilogy. It's called The Gospel of Sophia. We give it out for free in free PDF forums. You can also buy a hard copy from Amazon, but you can get it for free because wisdom should be free, even though really it's worth more than gold and silver, diamonds and rubies, as the Bible says. Sophia, wisdom, is worth everything you have. And we put together in this book, particularly the first book, The Gospel of Sophia, that Tyla Gabriel showed very clearly these 3 beings of Sophia, the 3 natures. She calls them in the book, in the trilogy, the mother, the daughter, and the Holy Sophia. She doesn't use the word Anthroposophia. That might throw some people off, but if you want the descriptions by Rudolf Steiner, you'd call it Anthroposophia. If you want Steiner's descriptions, it would be the mothers, the being of the Kyrioteites, of wisdom, and Anthroposophia. It's clearly there, but I believe that the time wasn't right, and perhaps it might have taken away the freedom of the individuality, the new Horus, who is the gathered up pieces of wisdom that are spread all over the world, or you could say the 14 sections or the 14 areas of anthroposophy that have been affected by Rudolf Steiner's indications and his tremendous wisdom that he gave us, his inspired wisdom. You can find it in this book. And then the book, second and the third part of the Gospel of Sophia, tells you the mechanism to attain self-initiation on your own, how it works in the human body, explanations of how it works in the world so that those who are materialists can be convinced that these mechanisms are very real. And then in the third volume, it goes out and reaches into every tradition, every wisdom tradition, and pulls down 22 letters for each tradition as phrases of wisdom that are taught in that particular religion or mythology. And this is a language of the spirit. This is the language of the angels. It's the language of the astral light so that you can enter into Sophia, because in the final verse in the presentation of the New Isis myth, Rudolf Steiner writes a verse and he says that Sophia has been pulled by Lucifer, as we talked about, pulled out into the stars, and there she is hidden. And they attempted to kill her. And so they try to make what the stars and what the cosmos is raining down to us from all directions into simply a mathematic formula into mathematics and number, weight, and measure. Well, this is materialism. So Lucifer, in pulling Sophia so far out the wisdom that it can't even be reached by a materialist at this point unless one felt the true wisdom and the power and the compassion of what the mothers have created as the physical cosmos. If you could understand that, then on the boats of spirit, he says, Sophia is brought back down to the earth. And this is an injunction for us to find this mother being, these mothers who have created the world we live in. But he describes in the Faust lectures how entering into the realm of the mothers is the most frightening thing you can do unless you are spiritually prepared. So the New Isis myth gives us the injunction to find the lost Sophia. In other words, as Isis went to find the lost Osiris and put together his 14 pieces, we must go into the cosmos, into everything created, the whole natural world, not just the stars, and we must put it together so that now Isis becomes Isis Sophia, and we become the Christ-in force that can recognize that. Because we already have, through the gospel, and particularly Rudolf Steiner's fifth gospel, we already have a picture of the Kyrioteites, the beings of wisdom, coming into the vessel of Mary, who was considered the mother of Christ, or at least referred to as the mother when Christ was on the cross, or let us say the Mary that accompanied Christ's ministry. And then we have, through the book Riddles of Philosophy, Rudolf Steiner describes in great detail exactly when the different physical constitutions, though the being of Anthroposophia does not have a physical body, she has developed all the characteristics that the humans have in their physical constitution of their physical soul and spiritual nature. And so it's given to us so that we can study it, and it is there before our eyes as an open secret. So we have a connection through anthroposophy and the wisdom of spiritual science, which also taps into the wisdom of all traditional religions, and theosophy, which is another worship of Theosophia, is now Anthroposophia. So instead of the wisdom of the gods, the past, which is the mothers, we have the wisdom of humanity, which is now Isis Sophia. So as Tyler and I talked about our times and the challenges of our times, we understood that a new icon is the answer for the human being to find wisdom even in what we consider the mess of our times, what some call the end times. Rudolf Steiner said that at the turn of the millennium, we would have a chance to see a picture of the apocalypse in a mini version. And so the question is now, is what we see around us the apocalypse, or is it that mini version, that contracted early experience of the apocalypse? Is it the end times, or is it simply a picture of what the end times, the war of all against all, will look like? Well, we believe and we have hope. And the hope is that Isis Sophia will arise in each human being, and that no matter what is happening around us, no matter if it looks as if the wisdom has been cut into 14 pieces and spread throughout the world and can't be pulled together, if we have this new icon, this new leitmotif, this new myth, we can literally transform through our consciousness everything that is around us. And through our own perception, we can make what some might consider a vision of hell that we see in the modern materialistic world into a divine vision of heaven. And that is the message of the New Isis myth. That is the content of Isis Sophia, of the mother, the daughter, and the Holy Sophia. And so we hope that by presenting this to you and by giving you the trilogy of the Gospel of Sophia to study, that this can be an antidote to the evil of our modern times. And it can be the hope of the future, and it can be the path of the human that is evolving towards their future nature, which is the nature of an angel. So we hope that you will enjoy this presentation and take a look at the Gospel of Sophia, which you can get online in a PDF form today if you would like, and start that path if you haven't, or have that path made very clear to you by the descriptions that we give there. And we hope then that what Rudolf Steiner said was the open secret of the first Goetheanum and the representative of humanity will now become the true mysteries of the personal initiation of the self into the higher self.